Love Your Kitchen, Designing the Heart of the Home, proudly sponsored by Blum, the podcast where we explore the art of crafting your dream kitchen. I'm your host, Faye Newman, a freelance kitchen designer with a passion for creating spaces that truly reflect the heart of the home. Thinking I would love a new kitchen, but where do I start? Do I start with the design process and go around all the showrooms? Or would it be best to contact a builder first to see what's structurally happening within the space? Do I need to knock that wall down? Do I need to apply for planning, etc.? In today's episode, I will be giving useful advice on where to start with your kitchen renovation project, which hopefully will help you answer any underlying questions you may have and reassure you on the most important elements to think of when embarking on a new kitchen project. In this day and age, we all live extremely busy lives. So the thought of starting any kind of renovation project, no matter how big or small, can seem very overwhelming. There are too many decisions that need to be made alongside needing to do the usual day-to-day errands like the chaotic school run or the dreaded food shop. So the thought of renovating and needing to potentially wash up in the bath for a few weeks is something that is, rightly so, not high on your agenda. Although unfortunately I can't help you with your washing up, I am hoping this episode will give you some insight on the best steps to follow when starting your upcoming kitchen project. So for me, the best place to start is getting a firm understanding of why you are wanting to change your existing space. Have you bought a house with a decent sized kitchen and then when you move in, you've realised actually the layout doesn't work for you? Or maybe the cutlery drawer has fallen off in your hands the first time that you've used it. It may be that the children have moved out, they've grown up, they've gone to university, and after you've done a little cheer, you realise, I don't need the extra freezer in the garage anymore, or maybe you've got a little bit too much storage in your space. So the key is really identifying what it is you're hoping to change about your existing space and the reasons for it. Once you have this in place, you can start to mould your process to best work for you. If you are thinking about having an extension but unsure where to start, I would always advise having an architect or builder to come out to site and work out what's structurally feasible for the space. Once you have gained advice on this, before committing, I would get a designer on board to help start to put an initial layout together for you. It is never too early to get a designer on board. I have been in so many scenarios with clients before when they have already confirmed the architect plans before approaching a designer and we need an extra 50 mil on a run of cabinets to get that perfect symmetry, or maybe the window positioning is slightly out, causing differences in the layout choices in order to make that sink a little bit more central. So it is always good to get ahead of the game and work out your layout before confirming anything. Also, going back to the point on understanding what you need to do with your project, get your designer involved in this as well. Make sure they get a firm understanding of what it is you're wanting to achieve with the space, because then they can also offer their advice as well. At this stage, I would start thinking about your wish list. Ask yourself questions like, how many ovens do I need? Do I prefer them to be eye level, or do I prefer the look of a range cooker with a mantle surround? Does the space warrant me to be able to do both? Do I want to incorporate seating anywhere in my kitchen? If so, how many people? Will it be high level seating? Do you want that to be lowered down? Shall I keep the kitchen where it is or move it into a completely different part of the house? Is that actually doable? Will the extension give me enough room to have the larger cabinets and the amount of worktop space I am after? So asking yourself these questions before saying yes to the new extension or applying for planning permission will give you clarity on what can be achieved with your space. Is it worth it? Will it add the value you are after? If you don't need any structural works and you are simply looking to refurb your existing space, I would advise getting a designer to look over your existing layout and what you are hoping to change, so you can lean on their experience and see how they would recreate the space. It is always refreshing getting a new set of eyes on the space, as it offers an outsider's perspective and it will most probably be different to yours. So today I am at the NEC in Birmingham visiting the KBB show, where I now have the pleasure of interviewing Johnny Gray, who, for the listeners at home, is an established British kitchen designer and the founder of Johnny Gray Studios. Johnny is known for his innovative and personalised approach to the kitchen design, often incorporating elements of psychology and functionality into his work. So I am very excited to have the opportunity of speaking with him today, and I'm sure you will be too. So Johnny, can you share a little bit about your journey into kitchen design and what initially drew you to the field?
Well, nice to be here and to share some ideas with you. I think kitchen design is one of those areas that was quite left out. It's a funny profession. In fact, it's not almost, in some people's eyes, even a profession. So my background, actually, I trained as an architect. But I also had a great passion for furniture. And those are probably the two key things that drive me. But also I have a great interest and a passion for food and cooking. You'll be not surprised to know. Big deal there. But I remember once saying at a cocktail party, just after I decided that I was going to tell people that I wasn't an architect, I was a kitchen designer. And this rather posh man said to me in a sort of snooty voice, he said, "What do you do? What does a kitchen designer do?" And rolled his eyes.
Oh, God.
And this was, 30 years ago or something.
Yeah.
And it made me realise just that people didn't think you needed a designer in a kitchen. Yeah. And I think that's a sad response to a room where you really often you need help. Now, it doesn't mean to say that, we're absolutely crucial to every single part of it, but just think how much pleasure and how much function we get or expect when we're in our cars.
Yeah.
Incredibly well-designed interiors and the rest. And you wouldn't say we don't want a car designer, would you?
Yeah.
So, and then you start to think of all the things you've got to get right and all the opportunities that you can miss without having a designer.
Yeah.
So, in other words, there's lots of scope. So for a person who's interested in design and making, it's a lovely career.
Yeah.
And I started off, I think, slightly naively, probably, but I certainly started off from a slightly different perspective from others. And one of the lovely things in my case, which is very unusual, my aunt was a woman called Elizabeth David, who was this food writer who kind of helped change our attitude towards food, cooking, kitchens. And towards the end of her career, she had a stroke. And my father, who was her doctor, said, "Look, why don't you start up a kitchen shop?" And she started selling kitchen utensils. By the way, nobody ever knew this, but she lost her sense of taste for a while. So it was a lovely thing to do. And the shop became an overnight sensation. Terence Conrad paid a visit. Lots of people paid a visit. The stock was sold out in entirety in the first week. So here was this young boy. I was a schoolboy at this point. And my favourite place to go was to see this shop. And it was so different. It had straw on the floor. It was in a kind of bombed-out basement of a little Chelsea shop that had been rebuilt rather hurriedly. And the vibe of all this French cookware and the crapness of English cookware at the time. It was enamel saucepans. It was, we didn't have nice things to cook in. So that was the double whammy for me, which was the pleasure of utensils in the kitchen.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I started. And then it got really fascinating. I decided I didn't like fitted kitchens. And I was probably over-influenced by my aunt at this point. But it wasn't entirely without truth what she was saying, that she said they were sold as places. In her case, she had a kitchen surrounded by basically bric-a-brac, bits of furniture and antiques she'd found in a local shop when she was doing her kitchen post-war. She had no money, she was a food writer. And I think I saw how that worked, and that gave me the confidence to think that you could design kitchens almost like using intelligent, focused bits of furniture, not units, and certainly not units around the wall. So then if you jump immediately to what's happening in post-war Germany, where they've got to rebuild things very fast, something interesting happens, which is an appliance maker decides they're going to standardize, basically, I think it starts with ovens and hobs, and then it goes on to dishwashers and other things. And it's a genius move, because suddenly the appliance maker can just guarantee large sales. And the cabinet companies, fairly quickly after that, cotton on. So they start making units, and they're all the same, and they all go around the walls. There's not much personalised design about this. And bit by bit, they improve the quality. And when they come to export to England, there's a really interesting thing that happens. They're well made, well, relatively speaking. There's a big new thing about dirt and hygiene. And the companies that do the advertising for them are almost all Anglo-American huge agencies that have made their money out of soap powder, women's hygiene products. You get the picture. So what they realise is they can frighten people into having fitted kitchens by saying that unfitted kitchens, or if you like, old-fashioned kitchens, are dirty. And I find that fascinating, because nobody will tell you that.
Yeah.
But once you start to look at that, my first real attention, certainly public interest, was when I had an article written about me in the Sunday Times in 1980. And the article was entitled, I had nothing to do with this, "Why This Awful Fixation with fitted kitchens. I had literally 3,000 inquiries over a year. I had people queuing outside my house. I just had a tiny little studio.
Yeah.
And then I realised that I'd hit on a zeitgeist. And then, in fact, I got so overwhelmed by work that I kind of slightly withdrew for a few years. And when I finally re-emerged in 1985, ready to kind of sort of change the world, I contacted a company called Smallbone. And they were very interesting. They were innovators, but they wouldn't have said they were at that point. They'd made a kitchen out of old bits of pine and out of collapsed pine furniture that collapsed in the caustic tank, just the facades. And they started marketing this because a journalist from the Daily Telegraph saw their yard full of all these rotting old pine fronts and said, would they make a kitchen? And she wrote about it in the Telegraph. She's a woman called Liz Williamson, 2 weeks before she wrote about me. And I was this crazy architectural student with lovely ideas about furniture.
Yeah.
They sold loads of kitchens. I don't think I sold a single bit of furniture, but I learned something.
Yeah.
And so I then called them up, and they said, come and work for us. Come and produce your ideas. And I sold them the concept of the unfitted kitchen.
Amazing.
And very, very quickly, it appealed to British people.
Yeah.
It was wonderful. We had massive publicity. Magazines would then divide kitchens into those two categories.
Yeah.
And that lasted until 1990, until they were sold to a holdings company, and then things went rather badly awry. Okay. And I set up my custom studio. So at that point, I felt quite frustrated because I felt that I was in contact with the nerve of what people wanted. And my kitchens were expensive because they were custom made. So I then started to look at education, and I wrote a book. And the first book I wrote was called The Art of Kitchen Design. And at that point, the Americans got very interested. And I had a rather exciting journey about changing the way that Americans might think about kitchen design. Kind of by accident, this wasn't my plan, but I loved the process of thinking about kitchen ideas. So to give you some very specific ideas so that people can get a sense that I'm not just talking nice ideas, they're working ideas.
Yeah.
The first one is called dedicated worktops.
Okay.
So in a small kitchen or in a big one, you need a sense of order. And what you don't need is loads and loads of work surface. What you need is targeted work surfaces. Yeah. And relatively speaking, when your hands are open wide, you don't need much more than about, shall we say, 800 millimeters maximum to do a particular task. And what you want is those needs to be at the right height with the right material. And you can actually create a sense of order with the height of countertops.
Yeah, so what height would you recommend? Because I've read about this, that you don't like, it's all about the ergonomics and not having to sort of bend down.
You're right, you're keeping me on the right track here.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't think anybody had done proper studies of kitchen ergonomics. I looked at Fordism, which mostly is in relation to how people respond to machines in factories. Couldn't find anything. But what I did find was that, from my own experience, because I hadn't been well, my body wasn't working particularly well, I did something called the Alexander technique. And this is a technique you learn how to move with a sense of economy.
Oh, okay.
And I applied these ideas. And by the way, you can buy a really good book, and it's well taught now. Mostly any students of drama and music have to learn Alexander technique because they often use one side of their body too much. So they have to learn how to manage that. And I did it with kitchen design. What the first thing is you want to measure is your flexed elbow. Forget what anybody else says. And depending on what you're doing, you want enough swing to be able to use a knife at a chopping block. At a sink, you're responding often to the bottom of the basin, so you want that to be higher because the surface that you're using, well, it's just as likely to be the basin as well as the draining board. And then for cooking, you need to be slightly lower because you've nearly always got a tool in your hand. And if you're concerned about eye safety, then particularly, say, fat coming out of a pan, it's better if that's slightly lower, further away from your eyes. I mean, there's lots of other things as well I can go into, but those kind of ergonomics.
So you would say, that even if the hob's sort of at a different height to the sink run as well, that's something that you would...
Very much so, because the next thing you're doing by making these different heights, you're making people get into the habit of doing things in certain places, and that's what I want. I mean, you could say I'm a little bit of a fascist here, but actually I'm not. I mean, if you think about this, say you've got an old chest of drawers from vintage chest of drawers. How many times do you pull the drawer out and it goes on the floor? You don't.
Yeah.
Now, these days, drawers have all got mechanical drawers on, so that's not an issue. So we learn our habits, and they become instinctive, and I began to pick that up. And so later on, I started working with neuroscientists and psychologists to try and check what I was doing was right. Yeah. So all the time, I'm installing these kitchens for people. Each one is different. I go back to them and I say, where are the faults here? Where are the good things? And bit by bit, I start to build up the confidence to be able to do more things. So the next thing I do is I look about how the eye works. And this is really interesting. So the eye itself it uses peripheral vision to wayfind. Now, peripheral vision is actually quite annoying to the brain. It triggers off your fight and flight response mechanism. So if you can organize a way of designing so you don't trigger off the fight and flight response mechanism, you can relax as you walk around the room. And the way I do that is something called soft geometry. So anything in the middle of the room, all the sharp corners are removed. They're curved. Now, there's another lovely thing about soft geometry. In smaller kitchens, particularly, you can expand the amount of work surface to the ratio to the floor area. So you can have slightly smaller corridors. And there's a lot of other things I can go on with. It's not about beauty, although there's a lovely thing about smoothness.
Yeah.
So imagine walking down a narrow tunnel, and it's lined with rocks. You ain't going to be thinking about anything else but being hurt. But imagine the same thing, lined with soft upholstery, you can breeze down it.
Yeah.
So that's the principle that I work on with a lot of the planning in the centre of often very tight spaces. We are talking about millimetres often.
Yeah. Okay, amazing. So you're quite precise even with, so I mean, I always get clients that are like, what distances do you recommend to be putting around sort of the island, things like that. So it's great from your perspective how you're talking about sort of the overall flow of the entire room and just making sure that, as you say, so you've got your targeted spaces, it's about building sort of habits, that sort of thing, which I think is very up and coming now with everything, isn't it, in the world? Like everything's habit driven. So I think that's really great approach.
You know, I'm not saying I sort of know it all, but I certainly feel that I'd like kitchen designers to use behaviour more. So I got to the point when I thought, well, who can I find who's the expert on these kind of things? And there's a movement called, basically it's called emotional design. It was a book written by an American academic. And he mentioned the fact that he'd been working with somebody called Daniel Goleman. And Daniel Goleman wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence. And this is the book, I think I don't know what the sales figures were, but in many millions. And I always felt at school I was called rather thick and stupid because I went to a kind of stupid school where they didn't understand anything apart from sort of being perfectly academic, which I wasn't. So I wrote to this man, and he was the editor of the New York Times psychology pages. Not expecting a reply. 2 days later, it's just at the start of email, this is just after the millennium. And he said, my wife's got all your books, and I see you've got a studio in San Francisco. When can we meet? And I looked at my watch, and I looked at the time, and I thought, whenever the next plane lands. And I did. I spent a day with him.
Yeah.
And he put me in touch with a very interesting guy called John Seisel, who wrote a book, for the first book, looking at how to measure the impact that buildings make. So people build millions of dollars worth of these buildings in the States, and nobody ever goes back and measures. And so we started doing talks together, and I started learning off him. And we looked at what the neuroscientists called hardwired needs.
Okay.
Or what we might consider to be our natural instincts. And that gives you guides to the different kind of behaviours that you could expect when people, like when they see fire or when they see a corner or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and then that's how you integrate that into your kitchen.
And you can. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a really interesting book written by a guy called Richard Wrangham called Catching Fire, which he reckons, he's an English psychologist who then went to Harvard and did further research, but he's also an anthropologist, and he claims that the way that we live in terms of pair bonding and the way our social behaviour has been incredibly influenced by cooking. Wonderful basic book for anybody interested in the behaviour around kitchens and cooking.
Well, it needs to serve so many purposes, a kitchen, doesn't it?
It does.
And this is it. And I think because we're now opting for open plan living, things like that, it needs to be a kitchen, a dining space, the lighting needs to be correct, for when you're relaxing, things like that. So it's it needs to serve so many purposes. Yes, so
I agree with you. I think lighting is really interesting because one of the interesting things about lighting is that it extends the use of the room. Particularly, I think people who've got open plan spaces at night suffer from a lack of intimacy in their spaces. Even people who haven't got that, who've got smaller rooms, the harsh kitchen lighting that's mostly provided is tragic. And there's so many examples of how you can do it. I mean, obviously candles help a lot, but there's plenty of other things that you can do with your lighting. And I sort of did a 1.5 minute video once to get some responses, to get people to come and hear a virtual talk that I was doing in the US. And we made this sweet little thing about evening lighting. It helped us get the numbers up, put it that way.
Yeah, I love that. So talking back, obviously we've gone on about the functionality of the design now, but how do you balance that with the aesthetics as well? So actually the style of furniture and things itself.
Well, that's a lovely question. So there's one absolutely crucial thing that I believe is true, which is that you should never copy one style. It will go out of date. Avoid, integrate and play. Use lots of different styles. That doesn't mean to say you need to go crazy, but you need to create, if you like, a sense of particularly listening to the customer, trying to absorb some of their love of colour or shape or stories and their objects. So I always try to, but just going back for a second to the idea of dedicated work surfaces, one of the things that you do, if you can basically draw in the culinary functions, you leave what I call social space or social wall space for a sofa, for a dresser, for an antique, for a vintage piece, whatever you want. Yeah. And that, to me, particularly if you've got small children, to have a sofa in the kitchen, to dress them before school. I mean, I can't tell you how wonderful that was for us. That's what we did. Yeah. Our sofa's now left the kitchen, actually, but the children aren't young anymore. Well, the grandchildren turn up, but, that's not the point. Yeah. There's a lovely opportunity to do the next thing I want to say to you is create perching points. Now, one of the most unwelcoming things, I think, is you go into someone's kitchen for the first time and you want to have a brief chat, but there's nowhere for you to lean, to be comfortable, to feel that you're welcome. Yeah. So I intentionally build in perching points.
Okay.
And that leads to all sorts of other stories. But
so that would be not only just actual physical seats, but somewhere where they could, as you say, perch up against it, or
it's about having temporary conversation. Yeah. This is not, obviously you need to have a table, and the table's a slightly different thing. That is in some ways, it's an extremely important part of the kitchen, and I have this phrase that it should be placed within the arc of sunlight. I think mix and match probably is what I'm saying.
And I always say to clients as well, because obviously they're always saying if it's their forever home, then great, because obviously they can go for what they want. But I think clients always fall in love with something initially, don't they? And then they try and navigate around it and be like, oh, actually, no, maybe I should go for this, because they see everything that's out there. And I'm just like, you should go with your gut and you should go with what you originally really like, because at the end of the day, you're spending so much money. Your kitchen's the heart of the home anyway. So you want to make sure that, that you're not buying for anybody else. You're not buying for somebody that's sort of moving in or anything like that. Like it's.
Well, there is something that might be of interest, and maybe we might cover this now. It's slightly in response to what you're saying about sustainability and forever kitchen, forever house. That's not necessarily going to be the case for a lot of people. The reason I'm particularly keen to I think we can answer the sustainability issue is this idea of the unfitted kitchen, the use of freestanding furniture, because you can take that with you. Yeah. You can change it when you don't like it. Now, it doesn't mean every piece can be completely unplumbed in, but if you look at the history of kitchens, say if you look at pre-war kitchens, you'll find that there was only one thing that was really fitted, and that was, funny enough, was a sink cabinet. The stoves were often just plugged into a gas main or electricity main, and obviously sometimes they were put into an old hearth, but they were freestanding basically. Yeah. Now, why on earth is there anything wrong with that? That's not a bad way of planning. Yeah. And that is basically a sort of unfitted kitchen. Now, there's one big exception to that, which I think should be built in, and that's a pantry. Yeah. The bigger the pantry can be, the better. The more money you save on cabinetry, the more efficient the use of space is. Yeah. So it's not a completely overall philosophy, but it's not bad. It's better than the fitted kitchen, because the fitted kitchen's got a problem. It's too much focused on the walls, and there's a huge, as you know, rebellion against wall units, which spike you in the eye, which don't really give a sense of what's going on in what. Yeah. So visual memory plays part of some of the research I've been doing more recently.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. No, that's interesting. I'm the same. Design's gone from adding cabinets absolutely everywhere, hasn't it, to really actually focusing, okay, what do I actually want to store in that cabinet? What function will this, or what purpose will this serve? And then that's where, you start to create those bit more of open spaces, and then, they become a bit more decorative. You can add a bit more personality into those areas. So,
yes.
And I've seen some of your designs, and they're very creative, they're very sort of unique and individual. And I think that's, so important for the end user, because it's
their home.
Exactly.
I think you're right. I think that's actually another realization that I probably knew this maybe all the way along, but I think I'm able to say even more so now that the kitchen is, I know it's a cliche, it's the heart of the home, but it really is a place that you should have a sense of belonging to. And if some designers come along and created just another bland, bunch of white cupboards or whatever, how is that? It's hard to do that. It's hard to make that homely. I think homeliness is such a lovely proposition, and domesticity, to me, is one of the biggest pleasures of life. So if we can do anything for our clients to make things more domesticated, or domesticatable, I would say, that's nice. And I think we do need to address the issue a little bit about hygiene, because if we put in harsh materials that never age, you get into a very different environment. You get into almost like an operating theatre sort of situation. And for those who are interested in culture here, there's an absolutely wonderful phrase that the Japanese have. They develop their own attitudes towards aesthetics and their own philosophies about design, and it's called wahi-sabi, and it literally means enjoyment of the of nature. It means having things that are not symmetrical. It means things that have aged. And we can learn a lot from that lovely philosophy. When somebody tells you that you've got to have this absolutely icy cold work surface that can be easily cleaned, think twice.
So going back to materials then, because I've noticed as well that you work with a blacksmith, don't you, regularly, like ceramicists?
Yeah, there's I mean, if we look at those edge bits first, I don't know how many students leave art school every year in this country, but a huge number. Now, find an art student who needs a bit of work, or who would love a bit of extra cash, or whose work you love, and get them to just do a little small part of the kitchen, of a door panel or whatever. The way we use art is often, you don't want too much of it because it's in your face. We use it in bands, but you can use it how you like. You can have it as a painting on the wall, and the other thing that's really lovely about art is, and I've done this a lot, is that I get each client to choose their favourite painting. Now, it might be one they've got in their sitting room, it might be something from the National Gallery, doesn't matter. But we use that as a starting point, almost like a palette of materials.
Oh, so almost like for interior designers, they say they start with a cushion. Yours is a painting.
Exactly.
For me, when I've worked with companies before and I work regularly with suppliers now, obviously we've got formats to go off in regard to like styles, ranges, colour options, things like that. But if you're going completely, you can create anything, sort of, where do you start? So that's answered my question in the sense of, so you start with the artwork.
I mean, I do, actually. I think that's really helpful to have, because it gives them a bit of pleasure too, that they feel they're involved.
For sure.
But going back to your probably the harder part of your question is, what surfaces do you use, for example, on countertops, is I think quite an interesting issue. Okay, so obviously around water, you've got to do something that's completely waterproof. So it might be stone or stainless steel. We actually also use Iroko. We can't use teak anymore for obvious reasons, but Iroko is, on the whole, grows quicker, but it has that high level of natural oil, so you don't need to do much with it. As long as you keep it reasonably dry and you don't let things that will rust on it, then you can basically have it on either side of the sink. And it's particularly good for two reasons. One is if you've got precious things like glasses you're washing up, it doesn't break. And the other one is there's some people with hearing issues who can't bear putting metal onto metal or onto stone. So, and you can have it on one side, you don't have to have it on both sides. So I think that answers a little bit that question. I mean, there's a lot of good new porcelain style products which, of course, have got great durability. But the thing I really partly wanted to talk about, which I think is really important, is about food preparation. The key material to use for chopping on is end grain wooden blocks. And usually this is a hardwood like beech or hornbeam or a maple. And when the wood is on its end, it's much denser. So when you cut on it with a knife, not only does it not scratch, but it doesn't blunt the knife. And that's crucial. You want to work on a material that doesn't blunt a knife. And the other thing, this is going back to my constant thing about hygiene, is research was done at the University of Wisconsin just before, in I think 1997, when they discovered that food increases on plastic 18 times faster than on wood. So in other words, it's actually almost hygienic. And no one's ever said this, but this is my interpretation. The reason is, I think, that wood's a living material. It's alive. Why? How did we forget that? And at that point, the government or the health authorities were going to stop butchers using chopping blocks. Guess what? When that research came through, the civil service presumably distributed it around to the local authorities, and suddenly butchers were allowed to keep their chopping blocks. So if you want to prepare food properly, have a fixed chopping block, and you hardly need to do anything with it. You don't put bleach on it, don't put acids on it.
Yeah.
Just use if you want to, if by any chance it gets damaged, sand it off and re-oil it with hot vegetable oil. And that's all. And I've got one that's 30 years old, and I tell you, it's still in perfect condition. I mean, I'm not saying don't have other boards. I mean, there are issues with garlic. Probably best to do that on a small cutting board.
Yeah. And also like raw meat and things like that.
I think I would certainly, if you do that, that's probably more sensible.
Yeah.
It's not absolutely crucial because you wash these things all the time and with hot water.
And regarding sort of cabinetry material and things then as well, is there any specific woods and things? I suppose it depends on the design as well.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, look, I think there's a nice handy thing. I mean, very clearly with centrally heated houses, you can't use solid wood everywhere.
Yeah.
You use solid wood in your door frames maybe, but most of it's going to be made, the carcasses are going to be made out of plywood or MDF.
Yeah.
And actually the new MDF has got low formaldehyde ratings, but there's a company in Belgium which I think is about to bring stuff over here which uses recycled MDF.
Oh,
so there are some new materials that we can start adopting, which I think is interesting. But the other thing that's really worth knowing for people is that veneers, although you may think that they're thin and slightly worrying, are nearly always the best wood in terms of the decorative choices.
Yeah.
And what we do is we use veneers which we often structure to look sometimes like they're made out of constructive, say, door frames, but we use in the smaller areas a much more intense veneer. So there's a veneer, for example, we use called Mazur birch, which every bit of this Mazur birch is different because the pattern is made by worms and it's never the same. So for drawer fronts, say, lovely thing to do.
Yeah.
And then you can choose the veneers you want depending on the mood you're trying to create. So do you want to have a light reflective wood or do you want some darkness and some rich?
Yeah.
What is your oyster?
It depends on what sort of architectural elements you've got. So if you're in like a barn conversion or something like that, you've got exposed beams, you want to sort of tie it in with that sort of tone of wood as well.
We should also say to listeners that with the appalling problems with ash dieback, some of the, around me, you drive on roads which you never saw through the trees, and now you can see right across the landscapes. If you catch some of those ash trees early, you can use them. They're almost gone, but ask your woodwork supplier to see if they can get any olive ash that's... Occasionally you get little white speckles, which is where the olive ash starts to deteriorate, but you can cut that out often. So we've been making our kitchens out of olive ash recently.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, amazing.
Lovely wood. Really recommend it.
Oh, good. Every client is unique, so how do you approach the challenge of designing kitchens that reflect the individual personality and lifestyle for each client?
Okay, let's go back into the hierarchy of how you approach a project. Initially, of course, you need to know how many children they've got, how many people are living in the property, etc. But very quickly, to me, I want to see what the scope is. My mental undressing, if you like, is about the space. And the first thing I want to do is to see whether there's access to a garden or view out the window. And is the view out the window usable? I think one of the most magical things is to be at your, should we say, in your kitchen, looking out to a window whilst you're actually preparing food.
Yeah.
Because preparing food takes the longest, and it's the most social of all the activities. So in answering your question, how do you make it suit someone's personality? Well, I think by giving them initially, we do 3 designs. And the first design will be what the client think they want. Quite a good move here, because nearly always they get it wrong. But you want to show them, if you like, on a drawing, what they proposed would be like. And then you do one which is right out there. You have some fun. And then you do one somewhere in the middle. Yeah. And you present all 3 to them and you say, okay guys, let's have a conversation. One of the things you don't want them to do is in 10 years' time think, oh my God, I wish we tried something else.
Yeah.
So you're almost helping them foolproof their future sort of worries, I think. But also you're doing a proper design job. So, so that's, and then, so what you do at the beginning of this process, it's all about being, on the whole, functional and practical. No, not completely, but, so it's not about aesthetics at all. We don't talk about materials.
Yeah.
But once you've got that footprint, and you've got a sense of what you can do to expand the pleasure of the architecture, because that's the next thing. In an old house, you might have a lovely old beam that comes down right in the middle of your island, and that you can use to hang things from. So see what assets there are in the room. I also have another thing, which is that if a kitchen is next to a garden and it hasn't got double doors or French doors, it needs them.
Yeah, just to bring in that natural light, as you say.
And the warmth of the air and the ease of using an outdoor space. So that would be high on my priority thing.
No, I would agree with those. I
Yeah.
always think, and I think some clients are like, oh, you know, this is a hindrance being in the middle of the room, or if they're doing a project where they're knocking through and they've got, say, like a beam that needs to be situated sort of within the central part of their island, and it's about making a feature out of that, as opposed to, as you say, just sort of having it as an afterthought.
Faye, let's just do a quick little number before we finish on central islands and peninsulas, because that's really crucial to listeners. Okay, so obviously if you've got the space, it's great to have an island.
Yeah.
And the crucial thing about an island is to make sure that we have this dedicated work surfaces thing. But one of the lovely bonuses is when you raise a countertop really high, you physically can't use it to prepare food on. Quite helpful. So you can put a lovely plank of wood, because no one's going to cut on it, ready to take anything that's been made. Any food and dishes that are ready should be on display before you eat it, because that triggers off all sorts of helpful things in your digestive system. But also it's a gift to the family or to who's going to eat it.
Yeah.
And also it's a measure of the cook being rewarded visually a little bit. So a raised height platform or a shelf on a central island is magic.
Amazing. So you'd always recommend that if you can?
Don't have it on the same level as the actual cooking surface.
Okay.
Because that will have other things on it, and
Yeah.
and it could have grease and dirt and hot things. This is just purely for finished dishes. But it can also act as a bar, and you can also
Yeah.
put stools right next to it, so it can act as a place where your partner can come and have a glass of wine or whatever.
Yeah.
So
So a
and
purchasing station.
yeah.
Perfect.
And then I think this is something that people might argue about, but I would have a really low-level work surface, like about 750 high, table surface height,
Yeah.
for children to use,
Yeah.
and for having small appliances on. Particularly, funnily enough, it doubles up for things like magic mixers and toasters. Now, this is an interesting thing. When you look at a toast, everybody puts a toast in and wants to literally lean their eye over and see the toast burning, or not burning, sorry. That's potentially a little bit hair-raising,
Yeah.
safety-wise. So if you put it lower down by, say, 8 to 10 inches, that solves that problem.
Yeah.
So we use that for both.
Okay. No, interesting.
But lovely to have, say, a pastry area where the kids can roll
Yeah.
pastry, make bread, make a mess.
Well, that's it. It's getting them involved, isn't it? And I think, I mean, yeah, again, working with clients and things, everyone has different needs, but I think, you know, families on the agenda, or you have a family, that forward thinking and getting them involved in such a,
I
you
would.
know,
And if we're going to talk about
paramount.
children, I've just published on my blog a little thing about cooking with children.
Yeah.
And there's one witty thing I think people will enjoy, is have a sacrifice cupboard. Don't have small kids put all their toys in another room. Have a toy cupboard, or let them use kitchen utensils, which things like Tupperware and
Yeah.
old pans. Let them arrange those and make fun with them.
yeah.
I can't tell you what pleasure it's been having my children in my kitchen. In fact, laughingly, the sacrifice cupboard got removed, all the utensils got removed, and my kids play in the forest next door, and they started doing things like getting up, dressed up as soldiers and as you know, kind of characters in the woods.
Yeah.
You know, they got changed in the kitchen, and I just loved that. I just thought, I don't want my kids in another room. I want them here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I always remember one of my favourite toys was my kitchen that my
Yeah.
mum bought me as a child.
Exactly. Why wouldn't
I
it
didn't
be?
think we'd be talking about this today, but I remember that. Yeah.
I just think that's so lovely. I mean, I
Yeah.
had some lovely memories of cooking for my mum too.
Yeah.
And I had a stool, but in her case. But pleasing my mum was something I wanted to do, or just being with her, I think.
Yeah, of course.
So yeah, but let's just finish on one thing about obviously people aren't going to be able to have islands and small kitchens.
Yeah.
But there's a very good alternative, and I hope I can persuade people to rethink. A lot of small kitchens are galleys, which is another matter. But if you've got a square small kitchen, the middle of the room doesn't usually get used, and that's where a peninsula
Works
comes in
well.
handy.
Yeah.
So very roughly, if you imagine putting, say, a 3/4 circle onto a base cabinet, and it can be roughly 800 millimetres, say, in diameter or less, you've got at least some eye contact with other people in the room while you're doing the cooking.
Yeah.
And it uses up the middle of the room. So peninsulas are, I think, incredibly helpful, but make them curved. Don't make them square, because that will cause a lot of problems with you walking around the room.
Yeah.
Every time you hit that sharp corner, it will irritate you. That's my sort of contribution towards people with slightly more awkward small kitchens.
Yeah, no.
The galley kitchen, I think, is for another podcast.
Yeah, I think honestly, I mean, there's so many different types of rooms. It's hard to sort of differentiate how we could create everybody's space, because they're all so different, they've all got different tastes, they've all got different sort of needs and things like that. So, but I think it's great just to almost just put an idea in someone's head that they haven't necessarily thought about before, and then it's like just thinking about it from a completely different angle, which is what we've done today. Does that dishwasher need to be on the floor? Does that need to be raised up so that it becomes more usable?
I was the first person to do that, and I got a lot of resistance from industry, and I was really pleased, because the bottom drawer, or bottom layer of a dishwasher, is about 100 actions to load, and if you have to bend right down, that takes extra time, but B, anybody over 60 doesn't want to do that. So raising it up by 300 mil, 14 inches, is incredibly worthwhile, and I beg anybody to do that, or have a dishwasher drawer. So I'll tell you a nice story. So I did that, got quite a lot of pushback from appliance companies in the UK, and when I did a tour of America, I'm talking about kitchen design, I went back the following year to the big trade show, and I remember going onto a stand. It was actually a company called Canek, which is a Canadian company that supplies the middle to low end of the American kitchen industry, and I saw my first raised type dishwasher. So I said to the salesman there, I said, tell me about that. He said, there's this wretched British kitchen designer who has these crazy ideas, and we thought we'd nick it.
It was you.
And they didn't know it was me. It was so nice. I thought, I'll just say nothing here. I was so pleased that they'd done this,
How could they say that about you, but then they've actually
done because
that?
I think that because they probably had bad feedback from appliance companies who didn't want it either. Because you have to send 2 people to lift it down.
Of course, actually, that's true.
But
that makes sense.
Tough. Sorry, but the customer comes first here. The ergonomics comes first.
No, definitely. And as you say, there are dish drawers out there. So with the Fisher and Paper drawers and things, you can have them. Where I've worked with an island before, where you've got your sink in the middle, and then you've got a dish drawer on either side. Or
really
for instance,
good.
if you do a lot of hosting and you want to put a single dish drawer for your glassware on the island, that would be by your seating section. And it's sort of forward thinking again. What, as you say, sort of having sections and really thinking through what the needs for those sections sort of throughout the room, and that's what makes the difference in regards to design. So
it's really interesting. Also, I can take a little bit of credit. I hope the listeners won't think I'm boasting, but I did a tour of Australia and New Zealand on kitchen design. It was funded by the industry was it in 2016, I think it was, and Fisher and Paykel invited me to their factory, and they gave me a special lunch, because the idea for the dishwasher drawer came from reading one of my books.
Look at
Isn't that nice? Yeah, it was really nice. Yeah.
I hope it was a good lunch, considering you gave them such a good idea.
I can't remember, but it's just nice to be there, really.
No, of course. So last question then. What's the most interesting project that you've ever worked on, or that you're currently working on, if you can't narrow it down?
I was talking to a friend today about this. I've hidden one project from view. I've never shown the public, because I thought if they ever saw it, they really would think I'm crazy. For an extraordinary guy called Felix Dennis, who was the publisher of many hundreds of magazines. He's died now. But he was a sort of rebel counterculture publisher who was published a magazine which had an obscene drawing on the front. And he was prosecuted by the Crown Prosecution Service for this obscene drawings. And Germaine Greer, by the way, was writing the article in the so it was high level pornography, if you like. And they were put in prison, and then they were put on trial. And it's an incredible story, so I'm just going to be very brief about it, because you can get the kind of man he was. So they go to the trial at Old Bailey, and the judge, and they get dressed up as school kids in skirts, and they're 3 guys, and the judge is absolutely furious with them, and he sends them to prison. He doesn't read the law properly. And at this point, the Beatles, the Stones, the Who have a benefit concert to raise the funds so they can fight the case and get them freed.
Oh my God.
And they do.
Yeah.
It happens. And as he walks out of prison, he gets back to his office in Goode Street in London. And as he walks into his office, his secretary says, I've got John Lennon on the phone. And he says, oh no, don't be ridiculous, it's just a journalist who wants to talk to me. And so I've really got John Lennon on the phone.
Oh God.
And he goes and spends a week with John Lennon. He sends the Rolls Royce round. And he claimed to me many years later that he played the drums on Imagine. And this guy was a real character. So first of all, he bought David Bowie's house in Mustique. And I went and did that in quite difficult circumstances, because I didn't really want to make any changes apart from the kitchen. That was the only. But we had a wonderful project. And then he said, right, now I want you to do something really amazing. And he built a barn, a huge, great timber barn, and he wanted me to design the interior on the theme of Treasure Island, books and trees. And I can't tell you what inspired. There was the biggest four-poster bed, which was also had a secret staircase in it. I mean, we went crazy with furniture. We designed a kitchen in the shape and in memory of a sort of 17th century opium catch. So you see why I didn't publish this.
Yeah.
Actually, in one of my books in the kitchen culture, I did show, I think, the kitchen, but I didn't show all the other spaces that we did.
I can imagine that
and it was such a lot of fun. And and I designed the biggest, I think, freshwater fish tank. So as you came into this building, you could see through the fish tank into the building.
Oh,
and there was a big palm tree, which was an air conditioning system, in the middle of a pool. I won't tell you what happened in the pool because it was also quite naughty, but we did a shell house inside the middle. And my wife was saying at the time, this is not very good taste, you know. Yeah. But actually, that's the whole point, is that why can't we have some fun with our designs?
Yeah,
why
absolutely.
do we have to always follow, modernism or whatever it might be?
Yeah.
So creativity, freedom, fun, and then have a little bit of function too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like his childhood dream. Like
It was,
just in one.
it was, and it was special.
Oh,
so yes, that's. I mean, I've done so many lovely projects.
Yeah, I know. I can imagine.
But
It's
that
hard
was
to
the
sort
one
of
that
narrow them down, but...
is on my mind at the moment.
Oh,
so.
bless you. Well, no, amazing. Well, thank you very much.
Not
for
at all,
joining
Faye.
me.
Well,
I've really enjoyed our conversation. I'm
good,
sure listeners
good.
at home will as well.
I think we're allowed to enjoy our conversations about kitchens.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Love Your Kitchen, Designing the Heart of the Home, brought to you by Blum, the podcast where we explore the art of crafting your dream kitchen. If you have any questions you'd like answering on the podcast or want to find out more about how I can help you, then please visit fayenewmandesign.com. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you have liked what we have spoken about, why not like and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Also, what you can do is click on the notification bell to keep yourself notified of all the new content to come.